Morning fog settles over Vienna in the winter of 1533, thick and gray, muffling the sound of boots on cobblestone. The air smells of burning wood, horse manure, and the damp wool of cloaks worn too many days in succession. Somewhere inside the medieval fortress that will one day become the Hofburg Palace, a scullery maid kneels in darkness, scrubbing grease from copper pots with sand and ash. Her hands are raw. The kitchen fire has been burning since before dawn, fed by wood hauled from the forest, and carried up narrow stone stairs by men whose names will never appear in any chronicle. Above her head, in rooms warmed by that same fire, rooms hung with Flemish tapestries and lit by beeswax candles imported at extraordinary expense, the Habsburg court prepares for another day of displaying power. The distance between those two realities, between the maid's bleeding knuckles and the ambassador's velvet doublet, is the true architecture of empire. It is a distance measured not in meters, but in lifetimes of invisible work. The Hofburg Palace, as it exists today, occupies nearly 60 acres in the heart of Vienna. It comprises 18 separate wings, 19 courtyards, 2,600 rooms, and 54 staircases. The palace complex includes everything from the imperial chapel to the Spanish riding school, from the National Library to the imperial treasury. Walking its perimeter takes 40 minutes at a steady pace. To walk every corridor, to open every door, to stand for just 1 minute in each room would require more than 43 hours of continuous movement. This is not a building. It is a city within a city, a stone organism that grew over 7 centuries, swallowing whole neighborhoods, consuming forests and quarries, drinking rivers of gold and labor until it became the physical manifestation of an idea. That absolute power must be absolutely visible. But visibility is expensive. Every surface that catches the light required someone in darkness to make it gleam. Every moment of imperial splendor was purchased with months of work by people whose existence was designed to be forgotten the moment their task was complete. The story begins not with grandeur, but with necessity. In the 13th century, when the Habsburgs were not yet emperors but merely dukes struggling to consolidate control over Austria. The first structure on this site was a fortress, stark and functional, built around 1275 on the northeastern edge of Vienna's city walls. It was called the Schweizer Tract, the Swiss Wing, named not for alpine grandeur, but for the Swiss mercenaries who would later guard it. Stone walls 4 feet thick, arrow slits instead of windows, a place built to withstand siege, not to impress dinner guests. Rudolf the first Habsburg to rule Austria was a practical man, lanky and long-nosed, known for riding hard and eating simply. He understood that power in the 13th century meant controlling trade routes and surviving the winter. The fortress he commissioned was designed to solve problems: where to store grain in case of siege, where to stable horses, where to lock up rivals. Beauty was not the point, survival was. But survival alone does not build dynasties. Survival merely postpones the question of what comes next. Over the following 200 years, the fortress expanded in fits and starts, responding to the changing fortunes of the Habsburg family. Each generation added what it could afford. A new tower here, a chapel there. Walls were extended, courtyards were enclosed. The construction was incremental, opportunistic, driven less by grand vision than by immediate need. Medieval building records are fragmentary, but we know that stone was quarried from Kaisersteinbrück, 30 miles to the south, and floated up the Danube on barges. Each block of limestone weighed hundreds of pounds and had to be cut by hand, shaped with chisels, hoisted into place with wooden cranes powered by men walking inside giant wheels like human hamsters. The quarrymen who cut the stone worked in conditions that destroyed their lungs. The carters who hauled it worked in conditions that destroyed their backs. The masons who shaped it worked winters without gloves because gloves reduced the precision of their touch. These are not romantic details. They are the price of every stone. By the early 16th century, the Habsburgs had become the most powerful family in Europe, ruling an empire that stretched from Spain to Hungary, from the Netherlands to Naples. With that expansion came a problem: how to make power legible. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, understood that people believe what they can see. An emperor who lives in a medieval fortress looks defensive, beleaguered, temporary. An emperor who lives in a palace looks inevitable. And so the transformation began. Not all at once, because the Habsburgs never had enough money all at once, but steadily, over generations. The fortress began its long metamorphosis into a palace. Walls were plastered and painted, courtyards were paved, windows were enlarged. Italian architects arrived with drawings of colonnades and loggias. The language of power was changing from military strength to cultural refinement, and the Hofburg had to learn to speak it. This is where the hidden costs begin to compound. A fortress requires soldiers and grain. A palace requires armies of a different kind. By 1600, the Hofburg employed a permanent staff of over 300 people simply to maintain the daily operations of the court. Cooks and butchers, bakers and brewers, laundresses and seamstresses, grooms and stable boys, chaplains and choristers, secretaries and scribes, tailors and wig makers, physicians and apothecaries, gardeners and rat catchers. Each role was part of an intricate system designed to produce the illusion of effortless majesty. The emperor appeared at breakfast, and food simply materialized. He walked down a hallway, and candles were already burning. He attended Mass, and the chapel was already warm. Behind each of these small miracles stood hours of labor performed before dawn by people who understood that their invisibility was the measure of their competence. The laundry alone was a full-time operation. Court etiquette required fresh linen daily. Tablecloths, napkins, bedsheets, shirts, undergarments, handkerchiefs, hundreds of items per day, all washed by hand in enormous copper vats heated over open fires. The water had to be hauled from wells or the Wien River, bucket by bucket, up flights of stairs. The soap was made on site from animal fat and lye. The lye burned the skin. The heat was suffocating. The work went on 6 days a week, year after year, performed almost entirely by women whose wages were half those of men doing lighter work. We know this not from celebratory chronicles, but from account books. The Habsburgs kept meticulous financial records, not out of historical sentiment, but out of paranoia about theft. These ledgers revealed the palace as a kind of economic black hole, consuming resources at a rate that constantly threatened to bankrupt the imperial treasury. In a typical year during the 17th century, the Hofburg spent more on candles than on books, more on horse feed than on musicians, more on firewood than on all the artists and architects combined. Firewood is an instructive case. The palace required heat from October through April, and heating even a fraction of those 2,600 rooms required hundreds of cords of wood. The wood came from imperial forests in Lower Austria, cut by foresters who worked on contract, hauled to the Danube by ox cart, floated downstream on rafts, unloaded at Vienna's docks, transported through the city streets, and stacked in vast cellars beneath the palace. The logistics of this operation involved scores of people and represented one of the single largest recurring expenses in the palace budget. And yet, to anyone walking the state rooms, the warmth seemed like a natural fact, as though palaces simply did not get cold. This is the essential deception of palaces. They turn labor into magic. They make effort disappear. The 17th century brought war. The 30 Years' War, which devastated Central Europe from 1618 to 1648, drained the Habsburg treasury and transformed the Hofburg into something closer to a military headquarters than a pleasure palace. Troops bivouacked in courtyards, wounded soldiers filled corridors, the smell of gangrene and gunpowder mixed with incense and perfume. Emperor Ferdinand II, a dour and fanatical Catholic, moved through rooms hung with crucifixes and relics, convinced that his mission was to purify Europe by fire and sword. The war cost millions of lives and left the empire financially ruined. And yet, even during the war, construction on the palace continued. Because stopping construction would have been an admission of weakness, and weakness, once admitted, invites collapse. And so, masons kept building even as armies starved. Painters kept gilding even as plague raged in the streets outside the palace walls. This is the logic of monumentality. Once begun, it cannot stop without invalidating everything that came before. After the war, the Hofburg entered a new phase of expansion under Emperor Leopold I, a man with a passion for music, theater, and architecture. Leopold was small and awkward, with a jaw so pronounced that he struggled to chew food, but he possessed an acute understanding of spectacle. He knew that after decades of war, the empire needed not just military victories, but cultural affirmation. He commissioned a new wing, the Leopoldine Wing, designed by Italian architects in the Baroque style that was sweeping Europe. The facade featured pilasters and cornices, pediments and balustrades, all designed to convey permanence and divine favor. The construction of the Leopoldine Wing required thousands of tons of stone, brick, timber, and lime. It required teams of sculptors to carve decorative elements and teams of painters to fresco ceilings. It required glassmakers to produce windows and metalworkers to forge hinges and locks. The project took years and employed hundreds of craftsmen, many of whom lived on site in temporary wooden barracks. Conditions were brutal. Construction injuries were common: falls from scaffolding, crushed fingers, infections from cuts that turned septic. There was no workers' compensation, no safety regulation. A man who could no longer work was simply replaced. The frescoes alone represent a staggering investment of human effort. To paint a ceiling fresco in the Baroque style, an artist first had to design the composition, then transfer it to the wet plaster in sections, then paint rapidly before the plaster dried, often while balanced on scaffolding 20 feet above the floor. The pigments were ground by hand from minerals and mixed with binders. Some colors, like ultramarine blue, were more expensive than gold. A single ceiling could take months to complete. The artist who painted it received a fee and perhaps a small pension. The apprentices who ground his pigments and mixed his plaster received wages barely sufficient to buy bread. What tourists see today when they look up at those ceilings is genius and beauty. What they rarely consider is the boy with pigment dust in his lungs, coughing in a basement workshop, working 16-hour days because his family needed the money. By the early 18th century, the Hofburg had become the symbolic heart of an empire that stretched across much of Europe. But symbols, like machines, require constant maintenance. The palace was aging, roofs leaked, foundations settled, plaster cracked, wood rotted. The ongoing cost of simply preventing decay was immense. A dedicated maintenance staff worked year-round, repairing damage, replacing materials, fighting the entropy that attacks all buildings but attacks palaces with special vigor, because they are so large, so complex, so full of delicate and expensive things. In 1723, Emperor Charles VI faced a crisis. He had no male heir, and under the laws of the time, that meant the Habsburg line would end with his death, unless he could secure international recognition for his daughter, Maria Theresa, to inherit. He poured vast sums into diplomacy and bribery, and he poured vast sums into architecture, because architecture was diplomacy. The grander the palace, the more permanent the dynasty appeared, the more likely foreign powers were to accept its continuation under a female ruler. Charles commissioned yet another expansion, hiring the most celebrated architects of the age. But money was running short. The treasury was strained by military expenses and the costs of administering a sprawling empire. Construction slowed, workers went unpaid, debts piled up. The gap between the image the palace projected and the financial reality behind it grew wider each year. When Charles died in 1740, Maria Theresa inherited not just a throne, but a catastrophe. Multiple European powers immediately challenged her right to rule, sparking the War of the Austrian Succession. She was 23 years old, pregnant with her second child, and facing invasion from Prussia, France, and Bavaria. The empire seemed on the verge of collapse. Maria Theresa was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but she possessed a formidable intelligence and an iron will. She also understood theater. When she needed the Hungarian nobility to provide troops, she appeared before them holding her infant son, appealing to their chivalry and sense of honor. It worked. The Hungarians rallied, she survived, and she rebuilt. Not just the empire, but the palace. Because for Maria Theresa, the Hofburg was not a vanity project. It was a tool of governance. She used it to host diplomats, to stage elaborate ceremonies that reinforced her legitimacy, to demonstrate that Austria remained a great power despite its military setbacks. Under her rule, the palace became more refined, more comfortable, more attuned to the emerging sensibilities of the Enlightenment. She modernized the heating systems, expanded the kitchens, and commissioned new interiors that balanced grandeur with a degree of domestic warmth. She also bore 16 children, many of whom lived in the palace. The Hofburg became, among other things, a nursery for archdukes and archduchesses, requiring nurses, tutors, governesses, and an entire support staff dedicated to the care and education of the imperial family. The children were raised in luxury, but it was a peculiar kind of luxury, hedged round with rigid etiquette and constant surveillance. They were taught languages, music, dancing, and deportment. They learned that their lives belonged not to themselves, but to the state. Maria Theresa herself worked obsessively, often rising before dawn to read reports and write letters. She was involved in everything from military strategy to the design of new wallpaper. She was also deeply conservative in some ways, fiercely Catholic, moralistic, obsessed with controlling the private behavior of her subjects. She established a kind of morality police to crack down on prostitution and adultery. She believed that the strength of the empire depended on the virtue of its people, and that virtue required constant enforcement. Her relationship with the palace was practical. She saw it as a machine that needed to run efficiently. When something broke, she wanted it fixed. When a system was wasteful, she wanted it reformed. She was less interested in adding new wings than in making the existing ones functional. This was a different vision of power, less concerned with overwhelming spectacle and more concerned with sustainable governance. But sustainability is always relative. The palace still required an enormous staff. By the mid-18th century, over 500 people worked within its walls on a permanent basis. This did not include the craftsmen, suppliers, and contractors who cycled through on specific projects. 500 people meant 500 salaries, 500 meals per day, housing, clothing, medical care. It meant a complex hierarchy of roles and ranks, from the Lord High Steward down to the boy who swept ashes from the fireplaces. Each position had its own uniform, its own set of duties, its own tiny domain of authority. The palace also required a constant flow of supplies. Food arrived daily from markets and imperial estates, meat and fish, bread and pastries, vegetables and fruit, wine and beer. The imperial cellars held thousands of bottles. The storerooms held linens, candles, soap, coal, oil, wax, spices, medicines. Managing this flow required record-keeping on an industrial scale. Inventories were maintained, expenditures were tracked, theft was a constant concern, servants were periodically searched. Trust was a luxury the palace could not afford. Beneath the state apartments lay a hidden world of basements and tunnels, some medieval, some more recent, all dedicated to the unglamorous work of keeping the palace alive. These spaces were dark, damp, and cold. They smelled of mold and lamp oil. They were the domain of the lowest-ranking servants, the people who carried coal and emptied chamber pots and scrubbed floors on their hands and knees. Tourists never see these spaces. They are not part of the official tour, but they are as much a part of the palace as the throne room, perhaps more so, because without them, the throne room could not exist. Maria Theresa died in 1780, and her son Joseph II inherited a palace and an empire. Joseph was a reformer, impatient with tradition, convinced that rational administration could solve any problem. He despised the extravagance of court life and tried to simplify it. He reduced the number of servants. He cut spending on ceremonies. He opened parts of the palace gardens to the public, believing that the people should have access to spaces previously reserved for the elite. These reforms were motivated by genuine idealism, but they also reflected financial necessity. The empire was running out of money. Wars, administrative costs, and the sheer expense of maintaining the Habsburg lifestyle had drained the treasury. Joseph tried to economize, but economizing in a palace is like bailing water from a sinking ship with a teaspoon. The costs are structural. They cannot be reduced without fundamentally altering what the place is. Joseph's attempts at reform alienated the nobility, who saw them as attacks on privilege, and confused the common people, who did not understand why an emperor would try to act like a bureaucrat. He died frustrated and exhausted in 1790, his reforms largely undone. The 19th century brought revolution. In 1848, mobs took to the streets of Vienna, demanding constitutional government and an end to aristocratic privilege. The imperial family fled the Hofburg for the safety of Innsbruck. For a few months, the palace stood nearly empty, its future uncertain. The revolution was eventually suppressed by military force, and the Habsburgs returned, but the event left a scar. The palace was no longer invulnerable. The people had breached its symbolic walls, if not its physical ones. In the aftermath, Emperor Franz Joseph I embarked on a massive rebuilding of Vienna, demolishing the old city walls and constructing the Ringstrasse, a grand boulevard lined with monumental buildings. The Hofburg was incorporated into this new urban vision. New wings were added, including the Neue Burg, a vast semicircular structure designed to house museums and libraries. The Neue Burg was intended as the first part of an even larger complex, the Kaiser Forum, which would have enclosed the entire Heldenplatz and created a monumental imperial quarter rivaling anything in Paris or Berlin. The project was wildly ambitious and wildly expensive. Construction began in the 1880s and continued for decades. Thousands of workers were employed. Entire neighborhoods were demolished to make way for the new structures. The scale of the operation strained the empire's finances, already weakened by military defeats and economic stagnation. The Kaiser Forum was never completed. Only one wing of the Neue Burg was finished, a fragment of a dream that had grown too large. Franz Joseph himself was a contradictory figure. He woke at 4 every morning and worked at a simple wooden desk, reading reports and signing documents with obsessive diligence. He ate plainly and dressed in military uniforms. He projected an image of duty and self-sacrifice, and yet he presided over a system of extraordinary waste and inequality. The court still employed hundreds of servants. Ceremonies still required elaborate costumes and settings. The gap between the emperor's personal austerity and the institutional extravagance of the monarchy was never resolved. His wife, Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi, despised court life. She found the Hofburg suffocating, its rituals absurd, its atmosphere oppressive. She spent as much time as possible away from Vienna, traveling restlessly across Europe. She was obsessed with her physical appearance, exercising for hours each day and eating almost nothing. Her beauty was legendary, but it was maintained at enormous psychological cost. She was deeply unhappy, and the palace, with all its grandeur, could offer her no comfort. In 1898, she was assassinated by an Italian anarchist in Geneva. Franz Joseph, already burdened by personal tragedies, including the suicide of his son Rudolf, continued to rule, increasingly isolated, increasingly irrelevant. The empire was fracturing. Nationalism was rising in the provinces. The old certainties were dissolving. And still, the palace had to be maintained. Roofs still leaked. Pipes still froze. Floors still needed scrubbing. The work continued, indifferent to political crisis, because buildings do not care about history. They only care about maintenance. By the early 20th century, the Hofburg employed over 1,000 people. This included not just servants, but administrators, archivists, curators, and security personnel. The palace had become a kind of bureaucratic organism, self-perpetuating, resistant to change. It consumed a significant portion of the imperial budget, and yet no one could imagine getting rid of it. It was too symbolically important, too embedded in the identity of the empire. Then came the First World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire entered the conflict in 1914, confident of quick victory. 4 years later, the empire lay in ruins. Millions were dead. The economy was shattered. Food shortages led to riots. In November 1918, Emperor Karl I, Franz Joseph's successor, renounced participation in government. The monarchy was over. The Hofburg suddenly found itself without a purpose. It was no longer the seat of an empire. It was just a very large, very expensive building. The new Austrian Republic, poor and unstable, had to decide what to do with it. Selling it was considered, but rejected. Demolishing it was unthinkable. Instead, the decision was made to repurpose it. Parts of the palace became museums. Other parts became government offices. The Spanish riding school continued to operate. The imperial chapel continued to host concerts. The palace survived by fragmenting, by becoming many things instead of one thing. This transition was not smooth. The staff had to be drastically reduced. Hundreds of people who had spent their entire lives serving the court suddenly found themselves unemployed. Pensions were inadequate. Savings were wiped out by inflation. The invisible workers who had made the palace function were discarded the moment they were no longer needed. The buildings themselves suffered from neglect. The Republic lacked funds for proper maintenance. Roofs went unrepaired, interiors decayed. By the 1930s, parts of the Hofburg were in serious disrepair. Then came the Anschluss in 1938 when Nazi Germany annexed Austria. Hitler appeared on the balcony of the Neue Burg to proclaim the Union to a cheering crowd. The palace, built to glorify the Habsburgs, was appropriated by a regime that despised everything the Habsburgs represented. During the Second World War, the Hofburg was damaged by Allied bombing. Several wings were hit, roofs were destroyed, collections were evacuated or looted. When the war ended in 1945, Vienna was occupied by the Soviets, and the palace was in ruins. The question, once again, was whether it was worth saving. Austria, devastated and impoverished, faced a choice. Rebuilding the Hofburg would cost millions. The money could be spent on housing, hospitals, schools. And yet, the palace was part of the national identity. To let it crumble would be to admit that the past had no value, that history was disposable. The decision was made to restore it, slowly, over decades, funded by a combination of government money and tourism revenue. This is when the palace entered its modern phase, its life as a museum and tourist attraction. Restoration work began in the 1950s and has never really stopped. Each year brings new projects, stabilizing foundations, repairing frescoes, updating electrical systems, improving accessibility. The work is painstaking and expensive. A single room can take years to restore, requiring specialists in everything from gilding to tapestry conservation. The palace today is managed by multiple organizations. The Austrian National Library occupies part of it. The President of Austria maintains offices in the Leopoldine wing. Museums operate throughout the complex. The Spanish Riding School continues its performances. Tourists wander the state apartments, guided by audio tours that explain the history in a dozen languages. Over 1 million people visit each year, each paying an entrance fee that helps fund ongoing conservation. But tourism creates its own problems. Foot traffic damages floors. Temperature fluctuations from opening and closing doors stress fragile materials. Humidity from human breath affects wood and textiles. The palace must be constantly monitored and constantly repaired. Sensors track environmental conditions. Conservators inspect objects on regular schedules. Nothing is ever finished. The staff today numbers around 200, a fraction of what it was during imperial times, but still substantial. There are curators and guards, cleaners and technicians, tour guides and administrators. The work is more specialized now, more professionalized, but it is still work. Someone still has to vacuum the carpets and polish the mirrors. Someone still has to replace light bulbs and chandeliers hanging 20 feet above the floor. Someone still has to scrub graffiti from marble columns when vandals strike. The budget is a constant challenge. Entrance fees cover only part of the operating costs. Government subsidies make up the difference, but those subsidies are subject to political pressure. When the economy contracts, funding for culture is often the first to be cut. The palace must constantly justify its existence, proving that it is not just a relic, but a living part of Austrian culture. Conservation technology has advanced dramatically. Modern materials can repair damage in ways that were impossible a generation ago. Laser cleaning can remove centuries of grime without damaging underlying surfaces. Digital scanning creates precise records of every object, allowing for better monitoring and restoration. But technology is expensive. A single laser cleaning device can cost hundreds of thousands of euros. Trained operators are scarce and command high salaries. The palace also faces challenges from climate change. Rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns affect the building's structure. Stone expands and contracts, wood warps, metals corrode. Extreme weather events, once rare, are becoming more frequent. A single severe storm can cause damage that takes months and vast sums to repair. And then there's the question of meaning. What is the Hofburg for in the 21st century? It is not a seat of power. It is not a home. It is a monument to a world that no longer exists, preserved at great expense because we have decided that preserving it matters. But why does it matter? What does it teach us? Perhaps it teaches us that beauty and injustice are not opposites, but partners. The same system that produced the sublime frescoes and the intricate carvings also produced the scarred hands of the laundress and the ruined lungs of the quarryman. The palace is beautiful because it concentrated resources and labor on a scale that allowed for beauty. But that concentration came at a cost borne by people who had no choice, who worked because the alternative was starvation. Or perhaps it teaches us about fragility. Empires feel permanent when you live inside them, but they are always one crisis away from collapse. The Habsburgs ruled for 600 years, and then they were gone. The palace survived because it was repurposed, because it adapted, because people made the decision again and again to invest in its preservation rather than let it fall. Or perhaps It teaches us about the relationship between visibility and invisibility. The palace wants you to see only the surface, the gold leaf, the marble, the crystal. It does not want you to think about the basements, the supply chains, the wage ledgers. But those hidden systems are what made the surface possible. They are the foundation on which beauty rests. Today, a visitor to the Hofburg can walk through rooms that once hosted emperors and ambassadors, can stand beneath ceilings painted by masters, can admire furniture and tapestries and porcelain collected over centuries. The experience is designed to be immersive, transporting. But if you listen carefully, if you pay attention to the quiet moments between tour groups, you can hear other sounds. The hum of climate control systems, the footsteps of guards on their rounds, the distant murmur of conservators discussing a crack in the plaster. These are the sounds of the palace as it actually exists, not as a frozen monument, but as a living entity that requires constant care. The people who work there now are the latest in a long line stretching back 700 years. They are not servants of an emperor. They are employees of the state, union members with contracts and benefits and vacation days. But in a sense, they are doing the same work their predecessors did, keeping the palace alive. They arrive each morning and unlock doors and turn on lights and check that everything is in order. They notice things: a loose floorboard, a stain on the wallpaper, a draft from a window. They report these things and repairs are scheduled, and the palace continues. The cost of this continuation is substantial. The annual budget runs into the tens of millions of euros. That money comes from ticket sales, government grants, private donations, and commercial ventures like gift shops and event rentals. The palace hosts weddings and corporate functions, renting out its historic rooms to people who want the prestige of holding their celebration in an imperial setting. This commercialization makes some people uncomfortable. It feels like a betrayal of the palace's historical dignity. But without that income, the palace could not survive. Dignity does not pay for roof repairs. There's a tension at the heart of the modern Hofburg, a tension between preservation and access, between maintaining the integrity of the past and making it relevant to the present. Should the palace be kept exactly as it was, a time capsule of imperial life? Or should it be adapted, modernized, made comfortable for contemporary visitors? Different stakeholders have different answers. Historians and conservators tend toward preservation. Administrators and politicians tend toward accessibility. The balance is constantly renegotiated. What is clear is that the palace cannot survive on nostalgia alone. It must be useful. It must serve a purpose that people in the present can understand and value. Museums educate. Concert halls provide cultural experiences. Government offices house the machinery of democracy. The palace survives because it does these things, not because it was once the home of emperors. And yet, the history matters. The fact that these rooms once witnessed decisions that shaped Europe, that these halls once echoed with the footsteps of Maria Theresa and Franz Joseph, gives the place a weight, a gravity that transcends its practical uses. People come not just to see beautiful rooms, but to feel connected to the past, to stand where history happened. But which past? The past of the emperors whose portraits hang on the walls, or the past of the laundresses and the coal haulers whose names are lost? The palace tells the story the emperors wanted told, but the physical fabric of the building, the worn steps and the soot-stained ceilings, and the narrow servant staircases tells another story if you know how to read it. The cost of the dream, the real cost, was paid by people who had no stake in the dream itself. They did not benefit from imperial grandeur. They received wages, often barely enough to live on, and in return, they gave their labor, their health, their lives. The palace extracted everything it could from them and gave back as little as possible. This was not unusual. This was how the world worked. but understanding that does not make it less brutal. And today, the cost continues, though in different forms. Taxpayers fund the subsidies that keep the palace open. Workers earn their salings by maintaining it. Tourists spend money to visit it. The palace still demands resources, still requires sacrifice, though the sacrifices are more diffuse, less visible, easier to ignore. To ask who paid for the Hofburg is to ask who pays for any monument. The answer is always the same: those who have no choice. Whether they are peasants conscripted to haul stone or taxpayers who cannot opt out of funding heritage sites, the cost is borne by people who may never benefit directly from what their money creates. This is the nature of collective projects. They require collective resources. The question is whether the burden is distributed fairly and whether the result justifies the cost. In the case of the Hofburg, the result is extraordinary. The palace is one of the great architectural achievements of Europe, a complex layering of styles and periods that reflects the evolution of power and taste over 7 centuries. It contains works of art and craftsmanship that cannot be replicated. It provides employment, generates tourism revenue, and serves as a symbol of Austrian identity. These are real benefits, and they matter. But acknowledging those benefits does not erase the cost. It does not bring back the mason who fell from the scaffolding or the child who ground pigments until her hands bled. It does not compensate the families evicted to make way for new wings or the soldiers who died fighting wars to fill the imperial treasury. The palace stands because of them, but it does not remember them. What we choose to remember and what we choose to forget is always a political act. The official history of the Hofburg emphasizes greatness, great rulers, great artists, great moments. The unofficial history, the history of labor and suffering and mundane survival, is harder to access. It exists in fragments, in account books and police records and hospital registries. It requires effort to uncover, and most visitors do not make that effort. But even if we do not remember the individuals, we can acknowledge the system. We can recognize that the palace is not just the product of vision and genius, but of exploitation and endurance. We can understand that the beauty we admire was made possible by structures of power that were deeply unjust. This does not mean we should tear the palace down. It means we should see it clearly, without illusion. The palace endures because people, generation after generation, have decided it is worth preserving. That decision has never been inevitable. It has always been a choice, made in the face of competing priorities and limited resources. Sometimes the choice was made for the wrong reasons, out of vanity or political calculation. Sometimes it was made for the right reasons, out of a genuine belief that the past has something to teach us. Either way, the choice had consequences. Today, the Hofburg faces an uncertain future. Tourism is volatile, subject to economic downturns and global crises. Government funding is unreliable, dependent on political whims and budgetary pressures. Climate change threatens the physical structure. And yet, the work continues. Conservators stabilize frescoes, technicians upgrade wiring, guards patrol the halls. The palace, vast and fragile, stumbles forward into the future, sustained by the same thing that has always sustained it, the labor of people who show up and do the work. What keeps the Hofburg alive today is not imperial power or aristocratic wealth, but something more prosaic: commitment. The commitment of curators who care about objects most people never notice. The commitment of politicians who allocate funding even when it is unpopular. The commitment of tourists who pay entrance fees and buy guidebooks. The commitment of workers who scrub floors and change light bulbs and check smoke detectors. These small acts, repeated daily, are what preservation actually looks like. Not grand gestures, but steady, unglamorous maintenance. This is the answer to the central question. Who truly paid for the Hofburg? Everyone who was ever forced to contribute to it, willingly or not. The quarrymen and the taxpayers, the servants and the soldiers, the architects and the day laborers. And who pays to keep it alive today? We all do, in small incremental ways, through entrance fees and taxes and the labor of the people who work there. The cost is distributed across society, shared by many, borne by few. And what does it cost to keep the dream alive? More than we think, and less than we fear. The dream of beauty, of grandeur, of connection to the past. It requires resources, yes, but it also requires something harder to quantify. The willingness to believe that such things matter. To believe that a frescoed ceiling has value beyond its monetary cost. To believe that preserving the past enriches the present. To believe that beauty, even beauty born of injustice, deserves to endure. This belief is not universal. Many people see monuments like the Hofburg as extravagances, as wastes of money that could be better spent on schools or hospitals or housing. They are not wrong. There is always a trade-off. Money spent on heritage conservation is money not spent on other things. The question is, what kind of society we want to be? One that values only the immediate and the practical, or one that values continuity, memory, and beauty? The Hofburg does not answer that question for us. It only poses it over and over with every budget cycle and every conservation project. And we answer it, collectively, through our choices. The palace will outlive all of us. Barring catastrophe, it will still be standing in 100 years, perhaps in 200. But it will only stand if people continue to care for it, continue to invest in it, continue to do the work. The palace is not eternal. It only seems that way because the work of preservation is invisible, folded into the background, taken for granted. To stand in the Hofburg today, in one of the grand staterooms, is to stand at the intersection of history and labor, beauty and cost. The room is magnificent. There is no denying that. The gilding gleams. The proportions are sublime. The craftsmanship is exquisite. But beneath the floor are basements where coal was once stored. Behind the walls are conduits for wiring and plumbing. Above the ceiling is a maze of structural supports and ventilation ducts. The room is not just a space, it is a system, and the system requires maintenance. This is true of all monuments, all institutions, all attempts to create something that lasts. They do not endure because they are strong. They endure because people keep them alive, and keeping them alive requires choices, resources, and work. The Hofburg teaches us that beauty is not free. It never was, and it never will be. Every gilded surface, every marble column, every painted ceiling represents an investment of human effort, and that effort had a cost. The question is whether we are willing to acknowledge that cost, to remember the people who paid it, and to make conscious, informed decisions about whether and how to continue paying it. The palace is a mirror. What we see in it depends on what we bring to it. If we bring only admiration for beauty, we will see only beauty. But if we bring curiosity about systems, about labor, about cost, we will see something else. We will see the invisible infrastructure that makes beauty possible. We will see the hands that built it and the hands that maintain it. We will see the choices, the trade-offs, the compromises. And we will see that the palace is not a relic, but a living thing, constantly adapting, constantly struggling to survive in a world that no longer needs emperors, but has not yet decided what it does need. The Hofburg survives because it has learned to be many things: museum, office building, concert hall, tourist attraction. It survives through flexibility, through pragmatism, through the willingness to change. This is not the story the emperors wanted to tell. They wanted a story of timeless grandeur, of power that needed no justification. But that story was always a fiction. The truth is messier, more complicated, more human. The truth is that great things are built by flawed people, funded by unjust systems, and sustained by the labor of those who are rarely remembered. The Hofburg stands today not because it deserves to, but because we have chosen to keep it standing. That choice has been made and remade countless times over 700 years by people with different motives and different values. Sometimes the choice was made consciously, sometimes by default. But it was always a choice, and it remains a choice. Every time we allocate funds for conservation, every time we visit and pay the entrance fee, every time we decide that heritage matters, we are making that choice again. We are saying that the palace, with all its beauty and all its blood, is worth preserving. We are saying that the past, even the uncomfortable past, has something to teach us. What it teaches in the end is this: nothing great is built without cost, and nothing survives without care. The palace is proof of what human beings can achieve when resources and labor are concentrated toward a single vision. It is also proof of the human cost of that achievement. Both things are true. Both things matter. To visit the Hofburg is to be a witness, not just to history, but to the ongoing work of preservation. The palace is not a finished object, but a continuous project, one that will require care and resources for as long as it stands. Recognizing that does not diminish the palace. It makes it more real, more human, more connected to the world we live in. The dream of the Hofburg was a dream of permanence, of power that would last forever. That dream failed. The empire is gone. But the palace remains, not as a symbol of eternal power, but as a testament to resilience, to adaptation, to the stubborn human insistence that beautiful things should not be allowed to vanish. The cost of that insistence is high, but so is the cost of forgetting. If we let the palace crumble, we lose not just a building, but a record of who we were, what we valued, and what we were willing to sacrifice. We lose a point of reference, a way of understanding how the world was made, and how it continues to be made. The Hofburg survives because work survives. Because every morning, people unlock the doors and turn on the lights and begin the work of another day. Because conservators examine frescoes with magnifying glasses and technicians crawl through attics to check for leaks. Because guards walk the halls and curators catalog objects and administrators balance budgets. Because tourists arrive, curious and hopeful, willing to spend a few hours stepping into a world that no longer exists except in these rooms. This is what keeps the palace alive. Not money, though money is necessary. Not beauty, though beauty is what draws people. But work. Daily, unglamorous, essential work. The same work that built the palace is the work that sustains it. And so the hidden cost, the true cost, is the cost of attention, the cost of caring, the cost of deciding again and again that this place matters enough to preserve. That cost is paid by everyone who chooses to remember rather than forget, to maintain rather than abandon, to invest in the past as a way of enriching the future. The Hofburg will stand as long as we are willing to pay that cost, not a sentence longer. If we truly honored the invisible hands that built and sustained our monuments, how might we differently measure the worth of what we choose to preserve?